It's Melanie White on the Sage Women's podcast, and I'm very excited to present Rebecca Mitchell today. Rebecca, welcome and thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. I know I meant to introduce myself, so I'm Professor Rebecca Mitchell from the Health and Wellbeing Research Unit at Macquarie Business School, Macquarie University.
I'm really excited to talk about some of the research that you've been publishing and talking about recently because it's getting a lot of conversation going. But before we do that, could you give us a bit of background into why you decided to jump into this space?
Actually, it was one of those very fortuitous situations where I was talking to a friend of mine who had thought that this could be an interesting place to research. And I had a look at what was available. I thought, oh, I'll see what there is. And I was just dumbfounded by the lack of information. And I called up my friend, who's the Professor Jungu, who is the Deputy Director of the Health and Wellbeing Research Unit. And I said, have a look and see if you can find things about menopause and work and see if you can see what I can't see. And he came back and he said, this is astounding. There's just such limited research out there. And a lot of what is there is descriptive, which is wonderful. It really is very, very good research, but just nowhere near enough. And then we had a look at some of the clinical work, and we could see that there was a good understanding in the clinical world of what was happening for women with menopause, but it just hadn't moved over to a broader understanding of what it means for women in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And we were inspired. Should I say inspired or horrified? We oscillated between being inspired and horrified. And we sought to understand what was going on. We found some wonderful international researchers who we are working with. So we have set up an international network called MENONET, and that encompasses probably about 80% of the world's researchers in the area of menopause and work, loosely. And it's fantastic. There's a lot that's happening. There are a lot of great ideas. There's a lot of effort. And I kind of feel that we're on the precipice of moving into making this almost a more mainstream and less taboo aspect of what it is to be well at work. So there's a very convoluted way of talking about what it is that led us to research in this area.
Thanks, Rebecca. And it's wonderful that MENONET is there now and is pulling together the international collective wisdom. And you mentioned a precipice. What do you think it's going to take for us to get to that point where we can start to implement all sorts of different initiatives to support women in menopause and help women stay well and at work?
It's a really interesting point because I think having researchers and practitioners who are interested in menopause is one big step, and we can do a body of work that helps us understand what's going on, learn about and develop our knowledge. But that needs to be met with a really strong government and organisational willingness to make change and to lead in this area. I think that's happening. So if I look to the UK, for example, they've had a number of parliamentary inquiries into this area, and they have sought to really push forward with a lot of different strategies. And I can see that happening in Australia. The issue for me is that we have to move, as I've said before, we have to move away from this being a clinical issue. So it's good that it is within a women's health strategy. I think that's fantastic. It's, I can't sort of speak highly enough about that. But this isn't just a clinical or health issue. It is a much broader issue for women. And therefore we need a whole of government approach. We need a much wider and broader response from organisations to understand for themselves, organisations as well as the women who work there, what do they need to do, how can they work together to address some of the issues that we can see happening for women at work.
It's so interesting, and I'm hearing you talking about what do organisations do, how can the government support a system-wide framework and rollout, and also what can individuals do. My sense is, Rebecca, that there's a bit of a trust gap between organisations and employees. I don't know if this has come up in your research. Have you found anything to suggest that perhaps employees don't want to talk about menopause because of the stigma, and employers might think, oh, that's in the too hard basket. Are we opening a can of worms? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, what a fantastic question. It's a pity this wasn't a really long 2-hour podcast. We could chat for ages. Look, I think this idea of stigma and taboo, you've just hit the nail on the head. So women, we've done quite a lot of research that looks at trying to untangle what menopause is for women, because it's not just menopause. It is the first, for many women, it is the first time where they're faced with growing older in a way that is undeniable and impactful and much earlier than they have often thought would happen. So we spoke earlier about, for 10% of women, this happens prior to 45. And many women see themselves in their 40s as being definitely not old. I mean, and I think they're right. But when menopause comes, they start to second guess themselves and say, okay, well, there is this thing called menopause and it happens at a particular stage. And so I'm confronted with age. And I'm also dealing with gender. So you have this intersectional stigma where you're moving into an older woman kind of category. A lot of the time it's in the woman's eyes and not external perception. So I think some of the stigma is related to this connection of older and women, and it's a much broader stigma. And then there is the stigma of menopause itself. And some of the work we've done, and believe it or not, this hadn't been done, we were just astounded. But menopause is actually a stigma itself beyond age and gender. And you probably, you're sitting there going, yes, of course it is. But it actually hadn't been researched, it hadn't been published. And until you know it, until it's been published scientifically, it's very hard for organizations, I think, to say, well, there's a body of evidence that tells me that this is true, and so I need to act on it. And that is not always a positive stereotype, that menopausal stereotype. One woman in our interview said, it's a Karen. I'm now a Karen. So I'm sure your audience will know what a Karen is, but it's not a positive stereotype. So yes, I think there's stigma. It's not just about menopause, it's about age and gender more broadly. And I think that what happens is women say, well, I don't want this to be known, I want to hide it. And so one of the things that we find is women are working extra hours. They're sleeping in their lunch hour, they're sleeping all weekend, working all weekend, because they're terrified that somehow they're not able to do the same job as they used to, that people will find out. And of course they get more tired, exhausted. That exacerbates, we know that stress and exhaustion exacerbates menopausal symptoms. So they notice that their menopausal symptoms are getting worse. And then for some women, and I think in your 40s and mid 40s, this is actually quite a number of women, they don't know that this is menopause.
Yeah.
So they have a strange group of symptoms that have just come upon them, and they don't really know what's going on. So they just work harder to try and compensate for whatever they think is happening, because some of those are, maybe I'm a bit more forgetful than normal. Maybe I'm a bit more tired than I was. So yes, I think for the women, I haven't talked about for the organizations yet, but definitely the stigma and stereotyping is massive. Then for the organizations, I think it's actually very difficult, especially if you're a young man who's supervising older women. It's almost threatening or intrusive. You feel that you're stepping into a personal area and you don't want to offer support because you feel like you might be perceived as making judgments about a woman's age or performance. So I know that it is extremely difficult. A lot of it, though, is because some of the great things that are coming out at the moment from the Australian government and organisations such as yourself and the UK are coming out now. So we have had, the last 100 years of not having this. So it's new. And we have to wait quite a while before I think this permeates into just broad management knowledge. I think if you go into the average MBA, for example, you're probably going to find good coverage of issues of diversity, age, gender, pregnancy. My question is, to what extent will menopause be discussed? I know that it is in Macquarie, but that's just because we are there. I think this is still hasn't hit mainstream management education yet. And until it does, we're going to have organisations and managers who haven't had or may not have had any exposure in this area.
Yeah, it must be a bit of a conundrum and a bit of a shock, almost like the psychosocial legislation that came out after the Boland report a few years ago. And, oh, what are we going to do about that? Do we want to even... I've spoken to organisations about that, and they're saying, well, we don't want to deal with that right now. It's not in our remit to have to be responsible for people's mental health at work. So, yeah, we definitely have to change that conversation.
Look, I think we do. And it's like the beginning of everything. It's like the beginning of smoking cessation. It's like the beginning of pregnancy leave. When you read about those or you live through it, I remember I was in Ireland when smoking was banned. And it was so amazing to be part of that, because the sort of, say, take the year before and the horror story, society would virtually be collapsing because of this smoking cessation. There was no longer going to be the kind of culture that we had. And then smoking stopped, the legislation came into place. And then a year afterwards, there was no discussion about how, wasn't it lovely when we used to all be able to smoke? I think running up to change and being in, right the pointy end is very difficult. We don't know how to do it. We don't know what it's going to look like. We're worried that it will change things for the worse, that resourcing will be an issue, that there's a massive educational component. But the way I look at it is it will happen, because once things are legislated, they do happen, certainly in this country, thankfully. And once we have fully implemented and responded to this, it will be a little bit, I think, like smoking cessation and pregnancy leave, where we look back and we think, why didn't we do that before? What took us so long? And we can see the benefits, not just for our employees. I mean, I take the employees' perspective, and I think it's wonderful for employees, but I take the organisation's perspective, and I realise that actually having a healthy workforce, a workforce that doesn't leave your organisation, that isn't absent, that is engaged, that, reducing presenteeism, that helps organisations to a large extent. And we came into this, one of the things we tried to do was bring that lens to menopause, that this isn't a woman's issue. Obviously it is a woman's issue, but it is an organizational issue, and the facts are astounding. They blew me away, and everybody I've spoken to. It's good research. I think we need to do probably more research and rigorously look at the research that's been done, but it's astounding the amount of money menopause is costing organisations because they are not responding the way that they can.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about the business case for organisations, maybe some painful numbers or anything else? I know you talked about a few of the things about
Yes.
absenteeism and presenteeism and the ripple effect of somebody's well-being at work and in life, but you've done the research, and we'd love to hear some numbers.
Oh, thanks. Well, there's a lot of international research in this area, and there's some national research. I'm a bit hesitant about some of the national research because the numbers are a bit tricky for me. But anyway, we'll look at the broader international research and then have a look at the Australian research. Really, it looks as though about 10 to 13% of women leave work because of menopause. And if you look at that, if you break that down and have a look at different categories of women's work, it's up around 25 to 30% of leadership, women in leadership roles that leave.
Yeah.
Some of those women in the leadership roles leave a leadership role and go into a role that's lower in the hierarchy, that's maybe part-time, but the majority, the 13%, 10 to 13% I'm talking about, they leave work. So that in itself has huge implications. I mean, McKinsey did a good report in 2019 saying that they categorized organizations in terms of their gender and leadership, and they found that those organizations that were in the top quartile in terms of gender balance, having women in leadership roles, performed at the top quartile in terms of performance. So it makes a big difference to the overall performance of organizations. But if you just kind of cut it down to the actual cost of turnover, that's astounding. If the AIST, the Australian Institution of Superannuation Trustees, they looked at this, and their estimate actually was that it was closer to 20% of women that left work, but be that as it may, they used a number of different calculations and came up with $17 billion that it was costing Australia, the women who were leaving work, in terms of lost wages, in terms of lost superannuation, because they were leaving work on average 7 years earlier than they planned. And then for organizations themselves, the idea of costing that turnover, we did some work in that, and we found that our most conservative was 5 billion, up to 10 billion, depending on how you can cost turnover a series of different ways. So we're not talking about trivial amounts. This is a really significant. And then what happens, of course, if you don't have women in those senior roles, you don't have any role models. So younger people at work can't see the older people that need to be visible for them to aspire. So you're actually cutting into this whole gender equality issue that we're trying to address in Australia.
And the loss of intellectual property.
Crazy. I mean, all those skills, all those capabilities, I think most people would agree, and certainly there's a lot of evidence here, that around that 45 mark, 45 to 50, this is when a lot of people are stepping into really high senior leadership. Even if you're not in a senior leadership position, you often have the expertise of decades of work. So you often are really good at your job, and organizations are losing that. I think, ironically, because Australia is, pardon me, as they say, the lucky country, we might feel it more than most. So a lot of women, it's some in a country where we have a good standard of living and we have a good system to support people, it's easier to leave work than in a country where we don't have those benefits, which means that maybe Australian women are more able to leave work, whereas women in other countries cannot leave work. And that might account for the slightly higher rates that we see in Australia of women leaving work.
Yeah. And so what do organisations need to do at the strategic level to accommodate an ageing workforce, and particularly women in menopause?
Well, that's interesting. And there's a lot of different ways to answer that, actually. So one way is because, with menopause, it's the gift that keeps giving. We talked about the symptoms, we'd be here all day. That it
Yeah.
can just range from every single aspect of your endocrine, your physical, psychological, everything. And herein lies the problem for organizations, because typically organizations want to put leave in place, so additional leave for menopausal women, which I think is fantastic. I'm definitely not arguing against that. And I think for women that helps with things like going to see a practitioner, a clinician. It helps with managing symptoms. So it's very, very, very important step. But because symptoms are so varied, and even the same symptom is experienced differently by different women, what we really need to do is to get rid of that taboo, that stereotype, and empower women to advocate for what they want. Because women will have different things that they want, they need to deal with their symptoms, and that will manifest itself differently in different jobs. So we interviewed some women who said, sorry, this always makes me laugh. One woman who went to her boss and said she had obviously hot flushing that was really difficult, and she asked to work in the stock area in the refrigerated room. And that was her for a few years, and everybody loved it, because I can imagine myself working in the refrigerated room is
Great
not
idea.
everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
So there are different things that are going to work based on different symptoms, different jobs, and different individuals. And no organization can really come up with something that's going to address all of those. So there are some basic things like, well, we've talked about leave, but I think addressing the stigma, addressing the taboo, and creating an environment where women can say, look, what would really help me was if I was able to work flexibly and start at 6 a.m. and finish at 3. Or, I want to work from home because I'm really tired and I have a 40-minute nap at lunch. Or I'm going to an endocrinologist and I'm going to need to have every Wednesday off for the next, couple of weeks. It's really very individual, which is, I guess, the difficult thing about menopause.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is it's about accommodating individual needs and allowing women, or giving them a forum to have safe conversations, to really negotiate ways that they can work differently and work around what they're going through.
Definitely. I will say one thing, and I think it's important, is that there's really not much evidence. Well, I haven't found any evidence, put it that way, that women's performance diminishes at all during this time. And that's because women work hard to cope. And if they can't cope, they leave work. So we're not talking about a situation where organizations are somehow supporting women when they're not performing. This is not that. This has not happened. Menopause and performance are not linked. I think that's very important, because there is a stigma there, or part of the stigma is that women aren't performing the way they should be during menopause. There's really no evidence about that. So what we're doing is probably trying to help women to continue to perform better, because a lot of the time the reason that they're performing is that they're taking this, taking work home, working longer hours, somehow managing it themselves. People talk about, having post-it notes everywhere. Although I don't think post-it notes are a thing anymore, probably phone notes, but, ways in which people are managing, either creatively, like working in a freezer, or probably not a freezer, a fridge, or using, things that help them remember, things that help them concentrate, things that allow them to cope with the fatigue. Because the fatigue is, there was a wonderful report written by the Korn Ferry Institute and released this year. And interestingly, they found that it was the fatigue that was most difficult for women at work, not hot flushing and some of the other symptoms that we, in popular magazines and things like that, that's what you read about, but it's the fatigue.
It's really interesting what you've just described, going back a couple of minutes, almost like for women, they're suffering in silence or putting up with it or pushing through with the stiff upper lip. But the result is it's almost like an all or nothing outcome. They push through and stay at work, or they leave.
Sadly, that's what happens. The other thing that happens, which is also very negative, I think, is they don't go for promotion. So there's a lot of evidence that at that time, when a lot of promotion opportunities are coming up, women are saying, no, I'm having difficulty coping where I am, I'm not going to go for that promotion. And we know that at work, sometimes when you don't walk through that door, that take that opportunity, the door closes, you're seen as somebody who's not ambitious, you're seen as somebody who's happy where they are, and you watch your peers move forward and you just don't have that opportunity again. Or people go part-time, that's the other thing we can see. And so all of those things mean that women's earnings and superannuation are lower, and women's superannuation is already at a lower base because they tend to have responsibility for child rearing and obviously pregnancy and things like that. So it is it's all or nothing in some ways, but there's a lot of negative impact beyond leaving work. I think with not going for promotion, that's something we hear an awful lot, that people are just saying, pardon me, well, I'm just trying to manage now, I'm not ready to go for promotion, and then that opportunity's gone.
And if we go further along the lifespan, we're seeing an increase in women's homelessness, women unable to get into the housing market if they're divorced or single due to their earnings, and that's a real problem. But I suppose it'd be great to end this podcast on a positive note and digging into some of the positive psychology and saying, what are the opportunities that this situation brings us?
Yes, very good. Sorry, I've been a bit of a downer, haven't I?
No, it's important that everyone understands the consequences of doing nothing. And I think we've talked through that really well. And your research has shone a lot of light on that, and other research. But then also to say, what can we do to make a difference, to change things?
Yeah, and the thing is, it's really easy. There's so much that can be done with very little investment, because the things that women want are relatively doable. They want to work flexibly so that they can have a 40-minute nap in their lunch hour. It doesn't cost anybody anything to allow that to happen. Training, education, this is not we're not asking for clinical level understanding. So it's relatively short training that's necessary to prepare supervisors and managers to deal with this. There is an awful lot that can be done through relatively easy policy changes and HR changes. So it's not like a lot of other issues that we've faced, where organizations are just thinking, we're not going to be able to do this, it's going to take too long, it's going to require too great resourcing. This is not what we're talking about. Women are amazingly resilient, I think, and clever at coping. And we're talking about women who are often at their peak or coming to their peak. So they know what they need, they can manage very well. It's just, if we have those supports in the workplace, women will be able to say, listen, here are the things that I want, that I need. These are the ways in which I can operate. And that's at an individual level. The policies that we can put in place. Australia's in this fantastic position in that the UK has moved ahead here, and there's nothing like being, watching somebody else step into a field and say, okay, this has worked, this has worked, this has worked, let's do all of that. We can learn very easily from those early starters and make things our own, because we are our own country with our own very, different kind of population and opportunities and resources. I think there's, it's a fantastic situation, because it's a very, not doing anything leads to pretty negative consequences that we can address very, very easily. Very easily. It's not as though we're asking for a lot, put it that way. It's not as though these policies have to be costly. Definitely not. So yes, I think, there's an awful lot that can be done relatively quickly, relatively almost cost-free, but certainly little cost, that will make a huge difference. One of the things that Macquarie is doing is we're offering free, very short sort of educational opportunities just within the Macquarie precinct. And there are lots of opportunities, perhaps not live sessions, but recorded sessions. There's a lot of information out there for organisations and employees. So a lot of the hard work has been done.
It's just a matter of people taking the lead and implementing and seeing the bigger picture as you describe. It doesn't have to be a big, onerous, difficult, complicated or expensive thing. It actually is quite easy to put in place a framework that demonstrates commitment and valuing that demographic.
Absolutely.
And also creating the support that they need to keep doing the job well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, that's the great thing about this field, isn't it? I just think we're in a wonderful position where we can actually affect huge change with really very little.
Thanks so much for your time today, Rebecca. It's been wonderful talking to you and hearing from your experience and wisdom. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Melanie. What a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.